Welcome to LearnAla, the ultimate educational space for learning and creating better learning. We're going to start with one of the most essential parts of economics, demand curve. Today's lesson will be split into two parts: understanding demand and what it means, and understanding utility. Demand shows a range of quantity and prices for a particular good or service. On the x-axis, we show quantity, and on the y-axis, we show prices. The relationship between price and quantity is the beginning of building a model for how we understand consumer behavior. A demand curve shows the quantity and price at an array of hypothetical prices. The demand curve represents consumer desire for a product and service, backed by the ability to purchase that good or service. The demand curve is intuitive by nature. The lower a price, the more people can buy that product or service. The higher the price, the more that someone cannot buy that product or service. This is an inverse relationship between price and quantity. So, what is the quantity demanded? The quantity demanded is the quantity consumers want to pay for a price. So, at each point across the demand line, it shows us the quantity demanded and the price. At point 1, if the price is 70, consumers will want demand of 30. And at point 2, if the price is 40, consumers will want a demand of 60. The demand curve is downward sloping. This is the result of an inverse relationship. There's an opposite relationship between price and quantity demanded. If the price falls, then people will buy more. If the price increases, then people will buy less. It's intuitive. So you'll always notice that the demand curve is downward sloping. And this is for 3 significant reasons that we're going to go through. So the first principle is called the substitution effect. And firstly, I'm going to describe what a substitute is. So you have 2 goods that are similar. So you could substitute that good for another good that is of the similar substitution. For example, butter or margarine, or tea or coffee. So essentially what the substitution effect is when we substitute one good for another good because of increases or decreases in price. For example, let's say you love to consume Coca-Cola, but the price of Coca-Cola increases by 20%. As a consumer, you look around for a substitute or a similar good. For example, Pepsi, which is still at the same price. You substitute Coca-Cola for Pepsi because it's cheaper. Therefore, on a fixed income, you can afford more of that particular good. And this is what creates the demand curve to be downward sloping, is it's kind of rational for people to want things to be cheaper, because when things are cheaper, they can have higher quantities of that good. And when things are cheaper, they have more disposable income for other goods. This brings us to our next point, the income effect. The income effect is where there's a change in your purchasing power resulting from a change in your income. So the more money you have, the lower prices begin to feel, the more you can afford. And this works both ways. The less money you have, the more expensive goods begin to feel, and the less you can afford to buy. This brings us to our last principle, the law of diminishing marginal utility. But before I explain this, let me explain to you what utility means. In economics, the total satisfaction or value that you receive from a product or service is seen as its utility. It is the value we place on things like goods and services. And this is going to vary from person to person because we have subjective and varying preferences. So, to understand diminishing marginal utility, we need to understand what marginal utility is. And marginal utility can be seen as the added satisfaction or added value from consuming additional units of a particular good and service. So let's say that you consume a glass of cola, and we're going to quantify the value that you get from that, which we're going to quantify at 12. Then let's say that you consume a second glass of cola, and we're going to quantify that value at 21. So the difference between 21 and 12 is 9, and that difference is your marginal utility. It is the additional value or the additional satisfaction you get from consuming an extra glass of cola. Think of it intuitively. Your first glass of cola is refreshing and it satisfies your thirst. Your second glass of cola is still quite refreshing and it satisfies your thirst. But you start to get to your third and your fourth glass of cola and you get a sugar overload and you feel like you might be getting sick of cola. You think maybe I actually want some water. So your marginal value or satisfaction that you're gaining is diminishing the more that you consume that particular good. So to summarize, the amount of satisfaction provided by the consumption or gain of a good decreases marginally with every additional gain. And this explains why the demand curve is downward sloping. The more you obtain of a good, the more quantity you have of a good, the marginal utility of that commodity is going to be less. Therefore, the consumer is not willing to pay higher prices for the commodity, and the demand curve will slope downwards.